Okay, if there were seatbelts on those seats, I'd ask you to plug them in. So to start with, I'd like you to consider the word worldview, right? And so a lot of people might think, oh, that's someone's ideas about what's the point of life? How should I behave towards other people? What's right and wrong? But for now, I'd like you to just think of it in the most literal terms, right? Like, what's the biggest view of the world that you can summon? So close your eyes and try to just mentally, well, don't keep them totally closed. Zoom out mentally of the landscape, right? Farther and farther until you get the widest view possible and think what it looks like. And I better pick this up because it's going on to slide 2. So it's easy to do that nowadays and make it look like something like this, where it looks like, oh, it's the satellite picture that I saw in the news, or the weather, or it looks like the Apollo pictures of Earth. Or if you zoom out far enough, it's going to be the Milky Way. And if you really know your stuff, you might think of galactic clusters and filaments and 100,000 galaxies all together, including ours, is the Laniakea cluster, supercluster, right? One of the largest things ever described. And it's this giant web of galactic matter, and it looks like someone just barely spat in some lemonade and started stirring it just a little bit. And so there's these webs and strands of matter and all this cool physics making hollows and a big network, right? If you know your stuff, you can maybe summon that much. But if you did this exercise a couple thousand years ago, you might think, oh, I'm just going to zoom out a little bit and then bonk, I'm going to hit my head on the firmament, right? This like mythical hard dome, this shell that all the stars and planets are painted on, and I don't know what happens really outside of that. Or you might think, oh man, I'm just going to fall off that never-ending waterfall, right? That's on the edge of the earth, and I'm probably going to splash off one of those elephants that holds it up, and then maybe off the turtle, and I don't know what happens after that. And to people like us now in the modern world who can send probes to deep space and we can land on the moon, that seems really quaint. It's like, haha, you didn't know very much. And you have this little line. That's the edge of your understanding. And you just come up against it like a wall, right? But what I would say is that no matter how advanced we think we are now, that edge, that limit to understanding, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. It's in the very big, of course, but it's also in the very small. It's inside of all your cells. It's inside the DNA coiled inside your cells that we don't fully understand. It's between all the roots of all the trees, of all the plants, where all these transactions of nutrients and water and movements of particles are happening. It's deep in the soil, between the soil particles, where life is growing and writhing and trying to make a living. And it's between the particles of space dust and outer space that's shielding us from UV radiation. And you might think, oh man, if I have to know all that now, all these frontiers, it's the edge of knowledge, I have to know all of those things in order to have a scientific worldview. How am I possibly going to do that, right? Well, if you think back to the idea of the Renaissance man, right? It's this romanticized idea that, oh, in the Renaissance, when people started caring about learning and rediscovering old knowledge, well, you could probably know several different disciplines and know everything that there was to know about science, right? And here, here's a great picture of it. There's the classical sage, and he's in his room, and he's gotten all the 10 books or so that he needs to have all the knowledge in the world, and he reads it. Right? And he's got a couple props because, man, that's scientific instruments. And now I'm done. I know it all, or most of it, right? You can't do that now. We're totally embedded in this giant stream of information pouring in from the internet as this giant global connection. And what do we see in there? You see information and disinformation and pseudo-information all mashed together, right? You got fake cancer cures over here, and you have vaccines cause diseases over here. And mixed into that is all that good science that I was just alluding to. And how are you possibly going to separate it out, right? So what I would liken the problem to, it's like the problem of having a worldview is this old parable. It reminds me of the old parable, maybe you've heard it other names, but I've always heard it called the elephant in the dark. And what it is an elephant is placed in a dark room, right? And then a group of people who have never seen an elephant and don't know what it is are allowed to come in and feel it. And they're supposed to figure out, what's this animal like from their own impressions. And of course, the people are going to get different patches of the elephant to explore. So they have different impressions. The one that's touching the trunk says, oh, this thing is very much like a snake. And then the one who's touching the big, broad side of the elephant is thinking, oh, this thing's like a wall. And the one who's touching actually the leg is thinking, oh, this thing's probably a tree. And the guy holding the tail is like, oh, it's a brush of some kind, right? And what happens is those fragmented pieces might be their impression until you turn on the lights, and the elephant is this much more interesting, complicated animal than anybody really thought before, right? That's a worldview when you put it together. So it works kind of, you can say, oh, that's a nice exercise, but you just had to come up with an elephant. Couldn't I have just pushed my hand a little bit farther and elbowed that guy who was feeling the tail? Well, what if you're talking about not just, those elephants, Now, what if the elephant is made out of exotic matter and energy that we don't really understand right now? What if it's a huge network of stars and masses and asteroids flying around? What if the elephant died so many years ago that there's no flesh left? We don't really know what it looks like. Those are the kinds of elephants we have to summon now with science if we want a worldview, right? How do we do that? We need to know it more than ever how to do it, because see that speck? Many of you probably know this famous illustration. It's actually a photo. That tiny speck, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Can you see that? I can barely see that. And what that is that's the longest range photo of Earth. That Carl Sagan said, hey, when you're sending Voyager spacecraft out of the solar system, turn it around. And he convinced NASA to actually shoot a picture of Earth. Not because it was going to have specific scientific value. It's just a couple pixels. That big rod that you can see coming down through the picture, that's just a little bit of glare that's coming off of the camera. That's how alone Earth is, that little pale blue dot. That's the name that he had coined for this image. And when you think about that, that's everybody. That's almost 8 billion people, and we're filling it up with us. And we've become so important and have such a heavy footprint that we've kind of risen to the level of any other, force of nature. We're competing with the atmosphere and energy from the sun and the physics of our Earth, and we're actually a force. We're kind of like in this giant, wrestling match or game of Twister. If we don't know what we're doing and how things work, we're in for trouble, right? So this is my secret weapon. Pictures can be read by the human mind 60,000 times faster than words, right? Imagine this. How many books do you read a year, right? So say someone can say, oh, I can only read one book a year. What if you could read 60,000 books a year? You might know something more, right? Pictures can be read in as little as 13 milliseconds, according to MIT and other studies. And what that means is that by the time you see a word, you're like, oh, that's a picture of word. What are words again? Oh, that's right, it's language. Okay, it's not totally natural. I have to go look that up. I think that word means such and such. And in the same amount of time, you can say it's a chimpanzee holding a stick. And you know that if you see the picture instead of hear it written for you. So I'm here to convince you that science art is our best crack at getting a good worldview. So I'm going to share with you that my favorite starting point is I love this quote by Neil deGrasse Tyson, right? Almost everybody's heard it by now. The good thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe in it. Right? It's great. I agree. And I've added this quote. A great thing about art is that it can help determine whether people do believe in science. Right? Because it's not quite the same thing to say, I know it's true, even if everybody's, arguing with me. So let's go back to that idea of like the Renaissance man who thought that he had everything covered. What was he really, revolutionary against? What was he working from that the Renaissance seemed like it was such an improvement in knowledge? Well, here's a good example. It happens to be an elephant. It's a classic example of, I don't have any science, and I have word of mouth. So this is a medieval elephant. Right? So think about the medieval period. There was all this classical learning that was Rome and this giant unstoppable empire. Boom, it's gone. And guess what? Hannibal isn't coming over the Alps anymore with elephants. The Colosseum isn't bringing them in to fight anybody. Western Europe doesn't really see elephants, but it knew they were something. They were huge. They were big, right? And they're in a lot of stories, so we got to keep drawing them. This is what you come up with when you don't have an elephant handy. And you don't have science. Right? And so, there were various artists, and they would try, and they're like, okay, it's like a big animal, and it's got these sharp things, kind of, but these don't feel like elephants because nobody was able to synthesize and share ideas or record them in art. And so you see this struggle. There's all these elephants that are trying to be elephants, but they don't quite get there, and this goes on for a long time until when you reach into the Renaissance, right, okay, guess what? There's a couple elephants that kind of show up. The Pope Leo X, he gets one as a gift, and this illustration was made because people said, oh yeah, there's an elephant. I can see what it looks like. I'm going to draw every wrinkle because, man, I am so sick of those elephants that don't look like elephants. And we're going to learn to draw them better. And guess what happens? These things start filling up all of the illustrations. So when you get an exotic animal like this one is a walrus from that time, because it was hard for a lot of people to find a walrus, right? It would be chopped up, boiled, dried, it'd turn into a piece of ivory. Then you'd get it in Europe, and you'd say, I wonder what this animal was. But the oral history would kind of give you This is one of those animals you draw on maps when you're like, here there be dragons, right? It still has a fishy tail. And so, but what's cool is you can see that get corrected as people start corroborating their visual imagery. And then some artists even, this is a walrus, by the way, they just say, come on, man, we just figured out the elephant thing. Can we just use that? It's probably the same. Got long teeth in it, right? But then, as time goes on, and we're heading towards the Enlightenment, what you see is that illustrations become more detailed. They become more precise. And what you see is that they're about information. They're about saying, I am actually going to look at this thing, and I'm going to draw all those details, because I know that my viewers are going to care, because we're making more records. These are radiolarians. So these are tiny microscopic organisms and delicate shells of branched glass and all these beautiful geometries. They're not just being recorded as vague brushstrokes. Now they're being meticulously drawn because people are appreciating that there's a lot of different things you can notice in the world, and a lot of categories that make sense. And when you keep those categories straight, then you can hang your ideas on them and facts, and then you can put theories on those facts and say, okay, let's see if we can move forward with thinking. So that eventually turned into like a greater attention to anatomy. Of course, these are the beautiful illustrations of Da Vinci, where people started saying, damn it, we're going to roll up our sleeves and we're going to actually find out what's going on inside of us. And that kind of anatomical knowledge, of course, fed back into art. And people could say, oh, I don't have to just draw rubbery arms on figures anymore. I'm going to make sure I know where those muscles are, because I want people to understand that pose. I want people to see the emotion in the face. I don't want these things to be vague. I want to get a real subtle idea across. So detail became more possible and more important from anatomy and kind of scientific illustration. So when I was, a young artist, of course, these are my illustrations, I followed in that tradition. I was like, oh yeah, it's really important to make sure I learn all the details first, so that when I assemble something, I can stand behind what I'm drawing. I can imagine that heavy pose of somebody falling in battle. I can imagine the anatomy inside the animals that I'm drawing, and I did a lot of dissection work and anatomical illustrations. And then as I became broader and broader, I've worked with lots of different scientists in many fields. I started getting into the high-tech stuff and cutting-edge genomics and medicine, and I saw this huge confluence of knowledge, and I was like, oh man, this is just a great time to be alive. There's going to be a second golden era of knowledge, right? All we got to do is be in a culture where all these things are known and swimming around, and we're just going to soak up knowledge, right? Wrong, because that's not how it works. What happens is we have so much stuff now that people have the freedom to say, I don't know about that round Earth. I think I've heard that it was flat. And guess what? You better prove it to me. We're going to start from zero. You got to really argue, right? I don't know if all this medical knowledge makes sense. I think I'm going to think of it myself and invent a new contrary way. And so science is kind of turning into like an opposition of opinion, which is fighting with democracy, which is fighting with self-actualization. And we're living in a crisis of science literacy. We can't have that. There's a lot of things that if you kick into it or see it in your daily life, you're not going to argue about it. You're going to say, oh yeah, naturalistically, I know how this acts, I believe it. Science is too complex to do that now without an interpreter. So, fortunately, science art has grown larger, and it has become more diverse than ever. And science art has even taken on a snappy new name. It doesn't take so long to say. It's SciArt, right? And as an insider, I can tell you what I've seen is that it seems to fall on a spectrum, which I came up myself. And at one end, there's something I like to call found art, right? You've heard of this term before. And what those kind of artists and scientists will do is they'll just take a picture of something right off the microscope, or they'll take it right off an instrument, and they're going to put a frame around it. And they're going to say, I want people to be confronted by this raw view of science. And I want you to be interested in, why is it mysteriously like this or that? And this is a slice, a super magnified slice of mineral. And that's their portal that they want to create for you to engagement with science. On the other end of the spectrum, I like to say that's where fine art seems to be. And it's these very personal experiences that, to me, they could be anything. They could be baked into clay. They could be stitched into a quilt. They could be projected as video or like holograms so that it makes like a moody environment. And so this is kind of a limitless end of the spectrum. And what it is it's more of an experience. You have to bring yourself to the art, think about it. It's not going to be handed directly to you. But personally, where I find myself, they'll edit that out, is right in the middle. And I think because that's where I feel comfortable, that's where I feel invested, I can do the most good. Building science literacy, where there's this sweet spot where you balance giving people a recognizable view of the world, but then also curating for them the meaning that you want them to absorb so that the science gets into them just by observing. So I would say this is my big premise and my motivating motto. Science art gives us an integrated worldview, right? The big grid-like elephant that I was really hoping we could get. So if you rewind the tape a little bit, think back to this first golden era of a hard science illustration. People were documenting the world. Here there's a bunch of octopus. Get them all off of the bottom of the ocean. Have a research vessel that actually has scientists on it. We're going to count and catalog and see if we can name different species of those things. That's important because we need to know what variety and biodiversity exists in the world so we can see exactly how those players work together, right? And so when I was starting out as an artist, I did a lot of this kind of work. So these are my trilobites, right, which took many diverse forms. And I thought, oh, this is great. You know, it's important to show people how exactly they were constructed so that people could imagine how did they live and what did they do in the world. I did a lot of natural history illustration. And of course, people have seen kingfishers before, and you may have seen great crested flycatchers. But every time someone makes another portrait, it makes more viewership that can say, oh yeah, I never really looked at how the wing tucks or thought about why it's carrying a snake skin that it's going to embed in its nest. And it actually might be a predator deterrent. And so I eventually applied those abilities towards reconstructing extinct animals like a giant wolf or I did use a battery, yeah. Or these more fantastical long extinct animals that have really no modern analog. And I've moved beyond even that into, of course, the giant blossoming of interest caused by Jurassic Park dinosaurs. And I devoted myself a lot of time to studying and reconstructing dinosaurs in great details. And the more that I worked in that field and got more commissions, yes, there's this B-monster movie appeal of, oh, there's this thing and it's scaly and it's got teeth. And, you know, that's what everyone's looking for. But not just the interest of who eats who and how. The more I worked on these illustrations, I thought, oh, for a really thoughtful restoration of what color is that animal? Exactly how is it standing? What's it built out of? You really have to zoom out and think, well, what's the environment that that animal evolved in? What are its daily activities? What's the ground under its feet? Who's running away from it? What is it chasing? And so I started getting into deeper and deeper environmental reconstructions, where it matters what are the small bugs that are swimming around their feet. How much water is there? What season are you drawing, right? Is this monsoon or not? What are they eating? How do they pull that out of the earth? Do they have an eye cocked for predators? What's going on in their little brain? And so this is a portrait, by the way, of the petrified forest of Arizona. This is a 30-foot-long mural that you can see if you go out there. And so I became really interested in the idea of saying, oh, we can make paleontological worldviews. So we can make a worldview of a lost world. And that enriches us. Not only does it tell us how the world was built and functioned, a lot of those periods and epochs and eras end in dramatic mass extinctions. And extinctions are kind of like giant last judgment figures that if you can illustrate that, you can see the mechanisms that lead to those environmental catastrophes. You can see the suffering here of the end of the Triassic where great seafloor volcanoes spewed out carbon dioxide, changed ocean chemistry, which changed the bacteria in the ocean and eventually suffocated everyone living at the surface. So, on that note, science art helps us to learn from the past. As I said, that there's large extinctions that have punctuated Earth's history. Well, guess what? When people are wondering today, it's like, I don't know, where are we headed? What's going on with global warming? What could all these climatic changes mean? The past is full of giant completed experiments that say, oh, this happened. It did that. Everybody died here. Okay, everything went back. And then they came back in this manner. And if you illustrate those steps, you'll get a greater sense of perspective that might help you predict where we're headed now when we can't see what's beyond the next line. But we have a large mass of science to calculate what we might see there. Science art helps gives us an immediate version of these past worlds to draw from as examples. This is a series of illustrations that I've done to stepwise illustrate the biggest extinction ever. 95% of all life died in the Permian. And what they think it was a runaway greenhouse effect. If you look at the little globes here, you'll see there's a little ulcer of volcanoes that started up, right? And that contributed to a lot of atmospheric carbon dioxide. That heated the globe eventually heated the seas. Seas can't hold a lot of oxygen when they get warm. Animals die. When animals die, they rot. Bacteria kind of take over their places. If you warm the seas enough down to the seafloor, frozen methane hydrates down there can volatilize, turn into huge bubbles like what they think is underneath the Bermuda Triangle and swallowing ships. But these are carrying giant loads of greenhouse gases which raise the temperature even more and give you a scorching globe where nothing really lives. So that's why I value paleo art. There is an aesthetic, there is a natural history of the past, but it gives us huge finished experiments in how a world goes wrong. So a lot of people, in the recent climate debates have said, oh man, all we got to do is we got to get more data out there. We know so much. It's just obviously the public doesn't have time to read all these papers. We'll mainline them more facts and numbers, right? And we've tried that, and it doesn't seem to break down the resistance that some people have. And I would say, here's an example of data speaking for itself. It's real. And it's true. And this is what science gives you. It gives you numbers. It gives you answers. And it gives you in the form of graphs. It gives you those answers really precisely. But when you're looking at that graph and this is all you've done and you haven't read the paper, it makes you forget the question the answer is answering sometimes. So I believe that science art can give you that. This is the same data that I illustrated. And what that graph was showing, in essence, the lesson is that if you think that there's a lot of problems caused by global warming, which is caused by carbon dioxide being elevated because we won't stop elevating it, then there's a cost associated, a social cost of carbon it's called, where we have to build new infrastructure after things get flooded, or we have to fight high temperatures. And the idea is that if you save natural spaces that can pull down that carbon and hide it in the soil and hide it in plants, then you can you're saving yourself that cost. So what that plot was showing, just a few slides ago, is that if you have a more diverse wildland, if you have a more diverse grassland actually here, it can store more carbon. It uses it in better and more ways, and there's a thicker store of it underground than if you had, as the illustration shows, just a lawn of one or two things. If you had a depauperate, if you had a poor biodiversity there, it would store less. It would save us less. Here's another illustration of the exact same story that I'd made. And it shows that, that value that we have in biodiversity, well, if you pull it off and you just leave yourself this gray, drab, human run-over present without all that diversity, you're losing that value. You're losing it to the air. It's not coming back. Science art lets us see through an expert's eyes. And this is something that I think is really basic, is that a lot of scientists, if you get them aside and you talk to them at length, or hours, or become their friend, they're fascinating. They're fascinating because they've spent years studying things at super basement, sub-basement, sub-sub-basement level. And all that comes out in conversation, but you need to spend that kind of time. And so what I feel that science art does is it allows us to distill all that knowledge that they can't really express in a word or two and squash it into something that we can get 60,000 times faster than reading the book, right? So here's an example. Remember that elephant that I was talking about in the dark, right? So in this case, the elephant has been soaked in a hot spring, right? Squashed really flat, buried in the earth for almost 500 million years, and then brought up, turned to stone, chopped into slices so fine you can see through the stone on the microscope. And a client came to me, and she found this in there. And what it is it's this tiny, tiny little glass-like vase made out of silica, right? It's so small that it was secreted by an amoeba that made it as like a snail-like shell for its back. And she says, Victor, I need to present this. This is a paper that's coming out. And so she gave me this sketch. And she's like, can you draw this? I'm glad I found you. You seem to know a lot about the subject. And that's not her knowledge. That's her sketch. And when she looks at that sketch, that's not all she knows is a vague line made in pencil. She clothes that with decades of work where she can see fleshy plants and water levels, and she sees a whole world. But if we asked her to be the only one that shares it with people, well, then that might be what she comes up with. This is what I worked with her to make. I put all her vision back on that skeleton, and it's a whole world. It's a whole past world with tiny little animals and tiny little plants that show us this view in the context when Earth was so early being colonized from the water that those forests that we can see, they were only knee-high. And that tiny little amoeba off there with its little dangling arms, it's wearing that shell that she found. Why is it important? It's made out of silica. Silica is a nutrient that moves around in large nutrient cycles. She had found the earliest example of an animal building itself that little house of silica on an amoeba. SciArt helps us care about things that we can't see. And I don't just mean things that are small and it's annoying we have to get a microscope for, but things that we can't see. And so here's an example. I was a freelancer for many years, and I still do a lot of different work, but now I work at NAU, and I work at ECOS, which is the Center for Ecosystem Science and Society. And what's great is that we essentially study everything, just everything. Because two pieces of life next to each other, that's an ecosystem, and it has behaviors and things that need to be understood. So this is an illustration that I made that's kind of like the systems biology large-scale portrait where you can see, oh, there's microbes under the soil, and what do? They produce gases, and those gases rise up to the clouds in the atmosphere, which are taken down by plants, which feed animals, which also have bacteria in them, which return to the soil. And so there's many multiple circuits overlaying that science is following and parsing out to try to figure out how the world works, right? So, of course, there's clouds of gases there. Many of you are probably thinking, oh, he's going to talk about climate change again and greenhouse gases. And yes, I am. Because one of the things that we work on at ECOS is one of the most dangerous possible tipping point landscapes in the whole world, the Arctic. Because the Arctic, think about it, it's been frozen since the Ice Age. All that dirt that's been building up when it thaws briefly and has like something like a warm season, it gets frozen there. And all that carbon that's hidden there is not being turned back into carbon dioxide. But if it thaws, it will be, because the soils wake up. Guess what? I'm going to show you a picture of this really dangerous landscape. I don't even have to draw it, because it's so dangerous, you're going to get it when I just show you the picture. And it's not. It's not dangerous. It's like really pretty. It's like I want to go lie down there and take a nap. It's like a Hallmark card. It's like all the bunnies in the world like donated their little tails and they just made it pretty, right? So, and this is just the wrong picture. No, I mean, you can't really see it there. Okay, that's not a good one. Okay, you see it right there, right? It's crisis. It's crisis. No. Okay, mud's scary, right? No, it's not. But with the X-ray vision of SciArt, right? You can see that this landscape is seething, is erupting in emissions, erupting in powerful greenhouse gases, because as it thaws and melts and bacteria wake up in the soil, they're eating that carbon, they're belching it out. And there's many ways that science is working on figuring out those circuits. And so one of the things we're trying to do is make a portrait at ECOS of that landscape and figure out the players and figure out the pieces and explain how this landscape that's undergirded by all these microscopic lenses of ice is dynamically changing and collapsing, and that there's ways that we can figure out that large-scale landscape view and how it's going to behave in the future. SciArt can build responsible drama, right? I was just trying to get drama out of trying to get drama out of some mud, and it wasn't really working, right? So let's just say that here in SciArt, remember I said I like to reside in the middle where I feel that I can do the most good? I've given it a name. Maybe it's just me, but accurate passion. And the idea is that I think that accurate passion is a sweet spot where you can build the most science literacy ever, right? Because you're giving people recognizable things, but you're also giving them the theatrical instincts that they have to care about how much things weigh and where they're going and how dangerous they are or aren't. So here's an example. I made this illustration for ECOS, and what does it show? It shows that in the northern forest there's periodic wildfires, and they're evenly spaced, more so, and it's a natural thing. It burns off trees, it burns off some of the soil, but over time more soil keeps building up. Until you get to the end of the picture, and you can see that recently fires are becoming more intense and frequent, and what happens? They burn a lot of that soil that's never been touched for hundreds or thousands of years. They're coughing that up into the air as ash and smoke and carbon dioxide. And what is that? That's legacy carbon, the new name that we've come up with for it. It's carried over from the past, and now it's being unearthed. Here's an accurate passion version of that same illustration. And it's totally different. What have I made? I've made like a floor where you can see that the legacy carbon has been stored for a long time, but the hand of wildfire has been dramatically exposing it and accessing it. And so there's this kind of large, visitable mental landscape that really shows us, oh yeah, I'd feel nervous if I was in the middle of a forest fire. I'd feel nervous if giant hands were flying around with the agency to change things. And that is how different this change is. Here's another version where I'd given a different kind of incarnation to wildfire, right? I'd given it this attitude like, oh man, we already blew through this space. We did our usual thing we do for wildfire. What's this? We can burn all this and liberate it. And it is a different way to have a forest fire. Also, some things don't really lend themselves to people understanding what they're doing and how they're doing it. So often bacteria are our protagonists. I dress them up in various poses that are carefully built metaphors. So you can see in this case, it's about how quickly they grow. In culture, they're growing in the background, and certain strains outpace everybody, but in the foreground, others are like laboriously falling behind. Those roles are reversed because it's a difference between the lab and nature. Here's another example of accurate passion that I think is worthwhile. So I was approached, after making some illustrations for ECOS, by a very important nonprofit who I really like, and I'm not going to say their name because they're on the slide. But they said, we found an illustration of yours that's just amazing. We want to put it in our annual report or our internal report. Could we borrow it essentially and just, we might tweak it just a little bit? Would this be amenable to you? And I said, yeah, of course. Here's the high resolution file. And then when they came back with it and said, well, here it is. Do you give your seal of approval? They gave me this. And it's okay. I mean, it's clear. There's lots of shapes, arrows, and everything's like tidy, right? If you follow it, you can read everything. And I get it. You know, people need graphic design. Things have to look smooth, and they think that clarity is what you get when you pare everything down, right? I don't know what's happening with that chicken in the middle. It's in a box. It's getting an X-ray. It's at the vet. It's not very concerned. Nobody is, because all the orderly little arrows are moving around. And what could be wrong in the world, right? This is the version I gave him. This is the version. And what it's trying to say is that this is the weird, hellish environment that we do industrially now when we grow chickens, right? It starts with a chicken that gets force-fed antibiotics. That's the green. Antibiotics soak into that chicken. Its gut bacteria evolved to resist it, to shrug off antibiotics, and guess what? It keeps making those bacteria into all of its environment. So we've constructed this ingenious type of industrial farm that keeps them in tiny cages. And I drew all of the missing feather stubble where they've been bashing against the bars and their bare wings that they can't do anything else except poke their head out and stare at their feed, right? And their feed is being constantly salted by more and more antibiotics that keep them healthy enough that they're going to survive this really stressful environment, right? All the eggs that even roll out of those chickens when they're allowed to be parents get sucked up by this machine that has like tentacles out of the matrix. And guess what it does? It injects every egg with more antibiotics so that the unborn chick there is coated in antibiotics when it hatches happily. And every meal that that chick will eat through its childhood, through its adolescence, until its very brief life is of slaughter age, is going to make it an incubator, a separate machine for making more antibiotic-resistant bacteria who don't die, who get turned into droppings that are taken away on conveyor belts and salted onto nearby fields as fertilizer, onto the food that we're eating raw with maybe washing it, onto our plates, into the actual waterways that carry fish, down into restaurants as carcasses, into meat plants where people are going to be spattered with those still living bacteria, back all the way to your kitchen table, onto your counter. If you don't wash your hands really well, it's in your mouth. In your mouth and all these other circuits into people, guess what? You're going to be in the hospital. And you know what? You're going to be the source then, the incubator. There's going to be doctors shaking your hand. There's going to be guests visiting. You're going to be part of this giant network that they need to give you even more antibiotics for, so that when you're well, those bacteria can escape into our environments and take a global tour of the world. That's what I gave them. That's the detail that I know we can handle because we're humans. We've evolved to hold that much information at a glance. You get the point.
Did a great job.